everybody, and welcome back to Fantasy Friday. Today we're going to be reading chapter number 7 of The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman. Last week, of course, we read chapter 6, and it was a bit of a short one, and it detailed Lyra's escape from the cocktail party and her subsequent rescue slash capture by the Gyptians and Tony Costa in particular. So now she's hanging out with the Costas and the other Egyptians, and we've yet to see what's going to come of that. So let's check it out here in chapter number 7, see where Lyra ends up. All right, chapter number 7, John Fa. Now that Lyra had a task in mind, she felt much better. Helping Mrs. Coulter had been all very well, but Pantalaimon was right. She wasn't really doing any work there. She was just a pretty pet. On the Gyptian boat, there was real work to do, and Ma Costa made sure she did it. She cleaned and swept, she peeled potatoes and made tea, she greased the propeller shaft bearings, she kept the weed trap clear over the propeller, she washed dishes, she opened lock gates, she tied the boat up at mooring posts, and within a couple of days she was as much at home with this new life as if she'd been born Gyptian. What she didn't notice was that the Costas were alert every second for unusual signs of interest in Lyra from the waterside people. If she hadn't realized it, she was important, and Mrs. Coulter and the Oblation Board were bound to be searching everywhere for her. Indeed, Tony heard gossip from pubs along the way that the police were making raids on houses and farms and building yards and factories without any explanation, though there was a rumor that they were searching for a missing girl. And that in itself was odd, considering all the kids that had gone missing without being looked for. Egyptians and landfolk alike were getting jumpy and nervous. And there was another reason for the Costa's interest in Lyra, but she wasn't to learn that for a few days yet. So they took to keeping her below decks when they passed a lockkeeper's cottage or a canal basin, or anywhere there were likely to be idlers hanging about. Once they passed through a town where the police were searching all the boats that came along the waterway and holding up the traffic in both directions. The Costas were equal to that, though. There was a secret compartment beneath Ma's bunk, where Lyra lay cramped for 2 hours while the police banged up and down the length of the boat, unsuccessfully. Why didn't their demons find me, though? She asked afterward, and Ma showed her the lining of the secret space, cedarwood, which had a soporific effect on demons. And it was true that Pantalaimon had spent the whole time happily asleep by Lyra's head. Slowly, with many halts and detours, the Costa's boat drew nearer the fens, that wide and never fully mapped wilderness of huge skies and endless marshland in eastern Anglia. The furthest fringe of it mingled indistinguishably with the creeks and tidal inlets of the shallow sea, and the other side of the sea mingled indistinguishably with Holland. And parts of the fens had been drained and diked by Hollanders, some of whom had settled there, so the language of the fens was thick with Dutch. But parts had never been drained or planted or settled at all, and, in the wildest central regions, where eels slithered and water-birds flocked, where eerie marsh fires flickered and way-lurkers tempted careless travelers to their doom in the swamps and bogs, the Gyptian people had always found it safe to muster. And now, by 1,000 winding channels and creeks and watercourses, Egyptian boats were moving in toward the Bianplatz, the only patch of slightly higher ground in the hundreds of square miles of marsh and bog. There was an ancient wooden meeting hall there, with a huddle of permanent dwellings around it, and wharves and jetties and an eel market. When the Egyptians called a bian roping, a summons or muster of families, so many boats filled the waterways that you could walk for a mile in any direction over the decks, or so it was said. The Egyptians ruled in the fens. No one else dared enter, and while the Egyptians kept the peace and traded fairly, the landlopers turned a blind eye to the incessant smuggling and the occasional feuds. If Egyptian body floated ashore down the coast, or got snagged in a fish net, well, it was only Egyptian. Later, Lyra listened enthralled to tales of the fen dwellers, of the great ghost dog Black Shuck, of the marsh fires arising from bubbles of witch oil, and began to think of herself as Egyptian even before they reached the fens. She had soon slipped back into her Oxford voice, and now she was acquiring a Gyptian one, complete with Fen Dutch words. Ma Costa had to remind her of a few things.
You ain't Gyptian, Lyra. You might pass for Gyptian with practice, but there's more to us than just Gyptian language. There's deeps in us and strong currents. We're water people all through, and you ain't. You're a fire person. What you're most like is marsh fire, and that's the place you have in the Gyptian scheme. You got witch oil in your soul. Deceptive, that's what you are, child.
Lyra was hurt. I ain't never deceived anyone. You ask. There was no one to ask, of course, and Ma Costa laughed, but kindly.
Can't you see I'm paying you a compliment, you gosling?
She said, and Lyra was pacified, though she did not understand. When they reached the Beyond Platz, it was evening, and the sun was about to set in a splash of bloody sky. The low island and the Zoll were humped blackly against the light like the clustered buildings around. Threads of smoke rose into the still air, and from the press of boats all around came the smells of frying fish, of smoke leaf or Genever spirit. They tied up close to the Zoll itself, at a mooring Tony had said had been used by their family for generations. Presently, Ma Costa had the frying pan going, with a couple of fat eels hissing and sputtering on the kettle on for potato powder. Tony and Kareem oiled their hair, put on their finest leather jackets and blue-spotted neckerchiefs, loaded their fingers with silver rings, and went to greet some old friends in the neighboring boats and drink a glass or two in the nearest bar. They came back with important news.
We got here just in time. The roping's this very night, and they're saying in the town. What do you think of this? They're saying that the missing child's on an Egyptian boat, and she's going to appear tonight at the roping.
He laughed loudly and ruffled Lyra's hair. Ever since they'd entered the fens, he had been more and more good-tempered, as if the savage gloom his face showed outside were only a disguise. And Lyra felt an excitement growing in her breast as she ate quickly and washed the dishes before combing her hair, tucking the alethiometer into the wolfskin coat pocket, and jumping ashore with all the other families marking their way up the slope to the Zoll. She had thought Tony was joking. She soon found that he wasn't, or else that she looked less like a Gyptian than she thought, for many people stared, and children pointed, and by the time they reached the great doors of the Zoll, they were walking alone between a crowd on either side, who had fallen back to stare and give them room. And then Lyra began to feel truly nervous. She kept close to Ma Costa, and Pantalaimon became as big as he could, and took his panther shape to reassure her. Ma Costa trudged up the steps as if nothing in the world could possibly either stop her or make her go more quickly, and Tony and Kareem walked proudly on either side like princes. The hall was lit by naphtha lamps, which shone brightly enough on the faces and bodies of the audience, but left the lofty rafters hidden in darkness. The people coming in had to struggle to find room on the floor, where the benches were already crowded, but families squeezed up to make space, children occupying laps and demons curling up underfoot or perching out of the way on the rough wooden walls. At the front of the Zoll there was a platform with 8 carved wooden chairs set out. As Lyra and the Costas found space to stand along the edge of the hall, 8 men appeared from the shadows at the rear of the platform and stood in front of the chairs. A ripple of excitement swept over the audience as they hushed one another and shoved themselves into spaces on the nearest bench. Finally, there was silence, and 7 of the men on the platform sat down. The one who remained was in his 70s, but tall and bull-necked and powerful. He wore a plain canvas jacket and a checkered shirt, like many Egyptian men. There was nothing to mark him out but the air of strength and authority he had. Lyra recognized it. Uncle Asriel had it, and so did the Master of Jordan. This man's demon was a crow, very like the Master's raven.
That's John Fa, the Lord of the Western Egyptians,
Tony whispered. John Fa began to speak in a deep, slow voice.
Egyptians, welcome to the roping. We've come to listen and come to decide. You all know why. There are many families here who have lost a child. Some have lost 2. Someone is taking them. To be sure, landlopers are losing children too. We have no quarrel with landlopers over this. Now, there's been talk about a child and a reward. Here's the truth to stop all gossip. The child's name is Lyra Belacqua, and she's being sought by the landloper police. There is a reward of 1,000 sovereigns for giving her up to them. She is a landloper child, and she is in our care. And there she's going to stay. Anyone tempted by those 1,000 sovereigns had better find a place neither on land nor on water. We ain't giving her up.
Lyra felt a blush from the roots of her hair to the soles of her feet. Pantalaimon became a brown moth to hide. Eyes all around were turning to them, and she could only look up at Ma Costa for reassurance. But John Faw was speaking again.
Talk all we may, we won't change out. We must act if we want to change things. Here's another fact for you. The Gobblers, these child thieves, are taking their prisoners to a town in the far north, way up in the land of Dark. I don't know what they do with them there. Some folks say they kill 'em. Other folk say different. We don't know. What we do know is that they do it with the help of the landloper police and the clergy. Every power on land is helping 'em. Remember that. They know what's going on, and they'll help it whenever they can. So, what I'm proposing isn't easy, and I need your agreement. I'm proposing that we send a band of fighters up north to rescue them kids and bring 'em back alive. I'm proposing that we put our gold into this, and all the craft and courage we can muster. Yes, Raymond Van Garrett?
A man in the audience had raised his hand, and John Faw sat down to let him speak. Beg your pardon, Lord Faw. There's landloper kids, as well as gyptians being taken captive. Are you saying we should rescue them as well? John Faw stood up to answer.
Raymond, are you saying we should fight our way through every kind of danger to a little group of frightened children, and then say to some of them that they can come home, and to the rest that they have to stay? No, you are a better man than that. Well, do I have your approval, my friends?
The question caught them by surprise, for there was a moment's hesitation. But then a full-throated roar filled the hall, and hands were clapped in the air, fists shaken, voices raised in excited clamor. The rafters of the Zal shook, and from their perches up in the dark, a score of sleeping birds woke up in fear and flapped their wings, and little showers of dust drifted down. John Faw let the noise continue for a minute, and then he raised his hand for silence again.
This'll take a while to organize. I want the heads of the families to raise a tax and muster a levy. We'll meet again here in 3 days' time. In between now and then, I'm going to talk with the child I mentioned before, and with Farder Coram, and form a plan to put before you when we meet. Good night to you all.
His massive, plain, blunt presence was enough to calm them. As the audience began to move out the great doors into the chilly evening, to go to their boats or to the crowded bars of the little settlement, Lyra said to Ma Costa, Who are the other men on the platform?
The heads of the 6 families, and the other man is Farder Coram.
It was easy to see who she meant by the other man, because he was the oldest one there. He walked with a stick, and all the time he'd been sitting behind John Faw, he'd been trembling as if with an ague.
Come on, said Tony. I'd best take you up to pay your respects to John Faw. You call him Lord Faw. I don't know what you'll be asked, but mind, you tell the truth now.
Pantalaimon was a sparrow now, and sat curiously on Lyra's shoulder, his claws deep in the wolfskin coat, as she followed Tony through the crowd up to the platform. He lifted her up. Knowing that everyone still in the hall was staring at her, and conscious of those 1,000 sovereigns she was suddenly worth, she blushed and hesitated. Pantalaimon darted to her breast and became a wildcat, sitting up in her arms and hissing softly as he looked around. Lyra felt a push and stepped forward to John Faw. He was stern and massive and expressionless, more like a pillar of rock than a man, but he stooped and held out his hand to shake. When she put hers in, it nearly vanished.
Welcome, Lyra,
he said. Close to, she felt his voice rumbling like the earth itself. She would have been nervous but for Pantalaimon, and the fact that John Faw's stony expression had warmed a little. He was treating her very gently. Thank you, Lord Faw, she said.
Now you come in the parley room and we'll have a talk, said John Faw. Have they been feeding you proper, the Costas?
Oh, yes, we had eels for supper.
Proper fen eels, I expect.
The parley room was a comfortable place with a big fire, sideboards laden with silver and porcelain, and a heavy table darkly polished by the years, at which 12 chairs were drawn up. The other men from the platform had gone elsewhere, but the old shaking man was still with them. John Faw helped him to a seat at the table.
Now, you sit here on my right.
John Faw said to Lyra, and took the chair at the head of the table himself. Lyra found herself opposite Farder Coram. He was a little frightened by his skull-like face and his continual trembling. His demon was a beautiful autumn-colored cat, massive in size, who stalked along the table with upraised tail and elegantly inspected Pantalaimon, touching noses briefly before settling on Farder Coram's lap, half closing her eyes and purring softly. A woman whom Lyra hadn't noticed came out of the shadows with a tray of glasses, set it down by John Faw, curtsied, and left. John Faw poured little glasses of Genever from a stone crock for himself and Farder Coram, and wine for Lyra.
So, John Faw said, you run away, Lyra.
Yes.
And who is the lady you run away from?
She was called Mrs. Coulter, and I thought she was nice, but I found out she was one of the Gobblers. I heard someone say what the Gobblers were, and that they were called the General Oblation Board, and she was in charge of it. It was all her idea, and they was all working on some plan. I don't know what it was, only they was going to make me help her get her kids for him. But they never knew.
They never knew what?
Well, first, they never knew that I knew some kids what had been took. My friend Roger, the kitchen boy from Jordan College, and Billy Costa, and a girl out the covered market in Oxford. And another thing, my uncle, right, Lord Asriel. I heard them talking about his journeys to the north, and I don't reckon he's got anything to do with the Gobblers, 'cause I spied on him and the master and the scholars of Jordan, right? I hid in the retiring room where no one's supposed to go except them, and I heard him tell them all about this expedition up north, and the dust he saw, and he brought back the head of Stanislaus Grumman. That's what the Tartars had made a hole in, and now the Gobblers got him locked up somewhere. The armor's bears are guarding him, and I want to rescue him. She looked fierce and stubborn as she sat there, small against the high carved back of the chair. The two old men couldn't help smiling, but whereas Farder Coram's smile was a hesitant, rich, complicated expression that trembled across his face like sunlight chasing shadows on a windy March day, John Faw's smile was slow, warm, plain, and kindly.
You better tell us what you did hear your uncle say that evening, said John Faw. Don't leave anything out, mind. Tell us everything.
Lyra did, more slowly than she'd told the Costas, but more honestly, too. She was afraid of John Faw, and what she was most afraid of was his kindness. When she'd finished, Farder Coram spoke for the first time. His voice was rich and musical, with as many tones in it as there were colors in his demon's fur.
This is dust,
He said.
Did they ever call it anything else, Lyra?
No, just dust. Mrs. Coulter told me what it was, elementary particles, but that's all she called it.
And they think that by doing something to children, they can find out more about it?
Yes, but I don't know what, except my uncle. There's something I forgot to tell you. When he was showing them lantern slides, there was another one he had. It was the roarer,
The what?
said John Faw.
The Aurora,
Said Father Coram.
is that right, Lyra?
Yeah, that's it. And in the lights of the roarer, there was like a city, all towers and churches and domes and that. It was a bit like Oxford, that's what I thought anyway. And Uncle Asriel, he was more interested in that, I think. But the master and the other scholars were more interested in dust, like Mrs. Coulter and Lord Buriel and them.
I see,
Said John Faw.
That's very interesting,
Said Father Coram.
Now, Lyra,
Said John Faw.
I'm going to tell you something. Farder Coram here, he's a wise man. He's a seer. He's been a follower in all what's been going on with Dust and the Gobblers and Lord Asriel and everything else, and he's been following you. Every time the Costas went to Oxford, or half a dozen other families come to that, they brought back a bit of news. News about you, child. Did you know that?
Lyra shook her head. She was beginning to be frightened. Pantalaimon was growling too deep for anyone to hear, but she could feel it in her fingertips down inside his fur.
Oh, yes, said John Faw. All your doings, they all get back to Farder Coram here.
Lyra couldn't hold it in. We didn't damage it. Honest, it was only a bit of mud, and we never got very far.
What are you talking about, child?
Said John Faw. Farder Coram laughed. When he did that, his shaking stopped and his face became bright and young. But Lyra wasn't laughing. With trembling lips, she said, And even if we had found the bung, we'd never have took it out. It was just a joke. We wouldn't have sunk it. Never. Then John Faw began to laugh too. He slapped a broad hand on the table so hard the glasses rang, and his massive shoulders shook, and he had to wipe away the tears from his eyes. Lyra had never seen such a sight, never heard such a bellow. It was like a mountain laughing.
Oh, yes, he said when he could speak again. Oh, we heard about that too, little girl. I don't suppose the Costas have set foot anywhere near then, since being reminded of it. You better leave a guard on your boat, Tony, people say. Fierce little girls around here. Oh, that story went all over the fens, child. But we ain't gonna punish you for it. No, no, ease your mind.
He looked at Farder Coram, and the two old men laughed again, but more gently, and Lyra felt contented and safe. Finally John Faw shook his head and became serious again.
I were saying, Lyra, as we knew about you from a child, from a baby. You ought to know what we know. I can't guess what they told you at Jordan College about where you came from, but they don't know the whole truth of it. Did they ever tell you who your parents were?
Now Lyra was completely dazed. Yes, she said. They said I was. They said Lord Asriel put me there because my mother and father died in an airship accident. That's what they told me.
Ah, did they? Well, now, child, I'm going to tell you a story. A true story. I know it's true because a gyptian woman told me, and they all tell the truth to John Faw and Farder Coram. So, this is the truth about yourself, Lyra. Your father never perished in no airship accident, because your father is Lord Asriel.
Lyra could only sit in wonder.
Here's how it came about, John Faw went on. When he was a young man, Lord Asriel went exploring all over the north, and came back with a great fortune. And he was a high-spirited man, quick to anger, a passionate man. And your mother, she was passionate too. Not so well born as him, but a clever woman, a scholar even, and those who saw her said she was very beautiful. She and your father, they fell in love as soon as they met. The trouble was, your mother was already married. She had married a politician. He was a member of the king's party, one of his closest advisers, a rising man. Now, when your mother found herself with child, she feared to tell her husband the child wasn't his, and when the baby was born, that's you, girl. It was clear from the look of you that you didn't favor her husband, but your true father, and she thought it best to hide you away and give out that you had died. So you was taken to Oxfordshire, where your father had estates, and put in the care of a gyptian woman to nurse. But someone whispered to your mother's husband what had happened, and he came flying down and ransacked the cottage where the gyptian woman had been. Only she'd fled to the great house, and the husband followed after in a murderous passion. Lord Asriel was out hunting, but they got word to him, and he came riding back in time to find your mother's husband at the foot of the great staircase. Another moment, and he'd have forced open the closet where the gyptian woman was hiding with you. But Lord Asriel challenged him, and they fought, there and then, and Lord Asriel killed him. The gyptian woman heard and saw it all, Lyra, and that's how we know. The consequence was a great lawsuit. Your father ain't the kind of man to deny or conceal the truth, and it left the judges with a problem. He'd killed, all right. He had shed blood, but he was defending his home and his child against an intruder. On the other hand, the law allows any man to avenge the violation of his wife, and the dead man's lawyers argued that he was doing just that. The case lasted for weeks, with volumes of argument back and forth. In the end, the judges punished Lord Asriel by confiscating all his property and all his land, and left him a poor man, and he had been richer than a king before that. As for your mother, she wanted nothing to do with it, nor with you. She turned her back. The Egyptian nurse told me she'd been afeared of how your mother would treat you, because she was a proud and scornful woman. So much for her. Then there was you. If things had fallen out different, Lyra, you might have been brought up gyptian, because the nurse begged the court to let her have you. But we Egyptians got little standing in the law. The court decided you was to be placed in a priory, and so you were, with the Sisters of Obedience at Watlington. You wouldn't remember that. But Lord Asriel wouldn't stand for that. He had a hatred of priors and monks and nuns, and being a high-handed man, he just rode in one day and carried you off. Not to look after himself, nor to give to the Egyptians. He took you to Jordan College, and dared the law to undo it. Well, the law let things be. Lord Asriel went back to his explorations, and you grew up at Jordan College. The one thing he said, your father, the one condition he made, was that your mother shouldn't be let to see you. If she ever tried to do that, she was to be prevented, and he was to be told, because all the anger in his nature had turned against her now. The master promised faithfully to do that, and so time passed. Then came all this anxiety about dust, and all over the country, all over the world, wise men and women too began worrying about it. There weren't of any of us account to Egyptians, but they started taking our kids. That's when we got interested, and we got connections in all sorts of places you wouldn't imagine, including Jordan College. You wouldn't know, but there's been someone watching you and reporting to us ever since you've been there. 'Cause we got an interest in you, and that Egyptian woman who nursed you, she never stopped being anxious on your behalf.
Who was it watching over me? Said Lyra. She felt immensely important and strange that all her doings should be an object of concern so far away.
It was a kitchen servant. It was Bernie Johansen, the pastry cook. He's half Egyptian. You never knew that, I'll be bound.
Bernie was a kindly, solitary man, one of those rare people whose demon was the same sex as himself. It was Bernie she'd shouted out at in her despair when Roger was taken. And Bernie had been telling the Egyptians everything. She marveled.
So, anyway, John Faw went on, we heard about you going away from Jordan College, and how it came about at a time when Lord Asriel was imprisoned and couldn't prevent it. And we remembered what he'd said to the master that he must never do, and we remembered that the man your mother had married, the politician Lord Asriel had killed, was called Edward Coulter.
Mrs. Coulter? Said Lyra, quite stupefied. She ain't my mother.
She is. And if your father had been free, she would never have dared to defy him, and you would still be at Jordan, not knowing a thing. But what the master was doing letting you go is a mystery I can't explain. He was charged with your care. All I can guess is that she has some power over him.
Lyra suddenly understood the master's curious behavior on the morning she had left. But he didn't want to, she said, trying to remember it exactly. He, I had to go and see him first thing that morning, and I mustn't tell Mrs. Coulter. It was like he wanted to protect me from her. She stopped and looked the two men carefully, and then decided to tell them the whole truth about the retiring room. See, there was something else. That evening I hid in the retiring room. I saw the master try to poison Lord Asriel. I saw him put powder in the wine, and I told my uncle, and he knocked the decanter off the table and spilled it. So I saved his life. I could never understand why the master would want to poison him, because he was always so kind. Then, on I, I the morning I left, he called me in early to his study, and I had to go secretly so no one would know. And he said. Lyra racked her brains to try and remember exactly what it was the master had said. No good, though. She shook her head. The only thing I could understand was that he gave me something, and I had to keep it secret from her, from Mrs. Coulter. I suppose it's all right if I tell you. She felt in the pocket of the wolfskin coat and took out the velvet package. She laid it on the table, and she sensed John Faw's massive, simple curiosity and Farder Corum's bright, flickering intelligence, both trained on it like searchlights. When she laid the alethiometer bare, it was Farder Corum who spoke first.
I never thought I'd ever set eyes on one of them again. That's a symbol reader. Did he tell you anything about it, child?
No, only that I'd have to work out how to read it by myself, and he called it an alethiometer.
What does that mean?
said John Faw, turning to his companion.
That's a Greek word. I reckon it's from aletheia, which means truth. It's a truth measure. And have you worked out how to use it?
He said to her. No, least I can make the three shorthands point to different pictures, but I can't do anything with the long one. It goes all over. Except sometimes, right? Sometimes when I'm sort of concentrating, I can make the long needle go this way or that just by thinking about it.
What does it do, Farder Coram?
Said John Faw.
And how do you read it? All these pictures around the rim,
Said Farder Coram, holding it delicately toward John Faw's blunt, strong gaze.
they're symbols, and each one stands for a whole series of things. Take the anchor there. The first meaning of that is hope, because hope holds you fast like an anchor so you don't give way. The second meaning is steadfastness. The third meaning is snag or prevention. The fourth meaning is the sea, and so on, down to 10, 12, maybe a never-ending series of meanings. And do you know them all? I know some, but to read it fully, I would need the book. I seen the book, and I know where it is, but I ain't got it. We'll come back to that,
Said John Faw.
Go on with how you read it. You got 3 hands you can control,
Farder Coram explained.
and you use them to ask a question. By pointing to 3 symbols, you can ask any question you can imagine, because you've got so many levels of each one. Once you got your question framed, the other needle swings round and points to more symbols that give you the answer. But how does it know what level you're thinking of when you set the question?
Said John Faw.
Ah, it don't know that by itself. It only works if the questioner holds the levels in their mind. You gotta know all the meanings first, and then there must be 1,000 or more. Then you gotta be able to hold 'em in your mind without fretting at it or pushing for an answer. And just watch while the needle wanders. When it's gone round its full range, you'll know what the answer is. I know how it works, 'cause I seen it done once by a wise man in Uppsala, and that's the only time I ever saw one before. Do you know how rare these are?
The master told me there was only 6 ever made, Lyra said.
Whatever the number, it ain't large.
And you kept this secret?
And you kept this secret from Mrs. Coulter, like the master told you?
Said John Faw. Yes, but her demon, right? He used to go in my room, and I'm sure he found it.
I see. Well, Lyra, I don't know if we'll ever understand the full truth, but this is my guess, as good as I can make it. The master was given a charge by Lord Asriel to look after you and keep you safe from your mother, and that was what he did for 10 years or more. Then Mrs. Coulter's friends in the church helped her set up this oblation board. For what purpose, we don't know. And there she was, as powerful in her way as Lord Asriel was in his. Your parents, both strong in the world, both ambitious, and the Master of Jordan holding you in the balance between them. Now the master's got 100 things to look after. His first concern is his college and the scholarship there. So, if he sees a threat to that, he has to move against it. And the church, in recent times, Lyra, it's been getting more commanding. There's councils for this and councils for that. There's talk of reviving the office of Inquisition, God forbid. And the master has to tread warily between all these powers. He has to keep Jordan College on the right side of the church, or it won't survive. And another concern of the master is you, child. Bernie Johansen was always clear about that. The master of Jordan and the other scholars, they loved you like their own child. They would do anything to keep you safe. Not just because they'd promised to Lord Asriel that they would, but for your own sake. So if the master gave you up to Mrs. Coulter when he'd promised Lord Asriel he wouldn't, he must have thought you'd be safer with her than in Jordan College, in spite of all appearances. And when he set out to poison Lord Asriel, he must have thought that what Lord Asriel was doing would place all of them in danger, and maybe all of us, too. Maybe all the world. I see the master as a man having terrible choices to make. Whatever he chooses will do harm, but maybe if he does the right thing, a little less harm will come about than if he chooses wrong. God preserve me from having to make that sort of choice. And when it come to the point where he had to let you go, He gave you the symbol reader and bade you keep it safe. I wonder what he had in mind for you to do with it. As you couldn't read it, I'm foxed as to what he was thinking.
He said Uncle Asriel presented the alethiometer to Jordan College years before, Lyra said, struggling to remember. He was going to say something else, and then someone knocked at the door and he had to stop. What I thought was he might have wanted me to keep it away from Lord Asriel too.
Or even the opposite,
Said John Faw.
What do you mean, John?
Said Farder Coram.
He might have had it in mind to ask Lyra to return it to Lord Asriel as a kind of recompense for trying to poison him. He might have thought the danger from Lord Asriel had passed, or that Lord Asriel could read some wisdom from this instrument and hold back from his purpose. If Lord Asriel's held captive now, it might help set him free. Well, Lyra, you better take this symbol reader and keep it safe. If you kept it safe so far, I ain't too worried about leaving it with you. But there might come a time when we need to consult it, and I reckon we'll ask for it then.
He folded the velvet over it and slid it back across the table. Lyra wanted to ask all kinds of questions, but suddenly she felt shy of this massive man, with his little eyes so sharp and kindly among their folds and wrinkles. One thing she had to ask, though. Who was the Gyptian woman who nursed me?
Why, it was Billy Costa's mother, of course. She won't have told you, because I ain't let her, but she knows what we're talking of here, so now it's all out in the open. Now you must be getting back to her. You got plenty to be thinking of, child. When 3 days is gone past, we'll have another roping and discuss all there is to do. You be a good girl now. Good night, Lyra.
Good night, Lord Faw. Good night, Farder Coram, she said politely, clutching the alethiometer to her breast with one hand and scooping up Pantalaimon with the other. Both old men smiled kindly at her. Outside the door of the parley room, Ma Costa was waiting, and, as if nothing had happened since Lyra was born, the boat mother gathered her into her great arms and kissed her before bearing her off to bed. And so concludes chapter number 7. Very interesting information coming out of this one. Not a whole lot of action, but a lot of information. We have now found out that Lyra's real father is Lord Asriel. She just thought he was her uncle, but yeah, he had a hand in siring her. Now, also, perhaps more importantly, Mrs. Coulter is actually Lyra's mother, according to John Faw. Wow, so that changes things. So this whole time, when she was hanging out with Mrs. Coulter, Lyra just thought she was some woman, but that's actually her mother. So Lyra now has a lot to think about, just as John Faw said. She's going to have to consider so many things. She ran away from Mrs. Coulter, but that's her blood mother, right? So she might feel a little remorseful about that. And with Uncle Asriel being imprisoned, that suddenly ups the stakes. If he were just her uncle, it wouldn't matter as much, but that's her real dad. So interesting stuff. Also, we found out that Ma Costa is the woman who nursed Lyra through her childhood and her infancy. So a lot of really interesting stuff coming together now. And we have some things to consider ourselves as readers. So think on that, try to predict what's going to come up next, and see how Lyra is going to react. So I look forward to seeing you all again next week, Friday at noon, so we can read chapter number 8 of The Golden Compass. All right, so I will see you all then. Bye now.